Ladies, gentlemen, and NBs of the jury, you are watching Running on 3 Hours of Sleep Law Review with your host, Mooney. If we haven't met before, hi, I'm a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. The Switch 2 recently came out, and if you haven't heard, it's been raking in seemingly record numbers of both sales and controversies. And chief amongst the Switch 2's many controversies is the allegation that Nintendo's new end-user license agreement, its new EULA, has the power to brick or disable your Nintendo Switch 2 console if you don't play by its rules. That's a terrifying idea, isn't it? A company based in a totally different country has power over a physical object that you purchased and own. Nintendo has the power to see into your console, understand what you are doing to it, and take that console from you if they don't like what they see. Your beloved Switch 2 that you paid X amount of money for could suddenly be bricked. But fear not, dear viewers, for the truth of the matter is that Nintendo has always been able and allowed to brick your devices. Furthermore, just about every other video game console you own is likely subject to similar provisions, whether it's made by Microsoft, Sony, or even everyone's favorite so-called good guy, Valve. And this legal power to brick exists, even in Japan, even in Europe, even in Brazil, to some extent. For you see, the power to brick your device is not an exclusive quirk of American IP law per se, but of international IP law. Because of American IP law. There are a lot of moving parts here, but my rather controversial opinion perhaps is that this Switch 2 bricking business ultimately isn't a big deal in isolation. Excluding a provision from a EULA does not mean that the power doesn't exist. It is virtually always better for everyone when companies are transparent about the powers that they have over you. This having been said, I think the wider EULA issue is but a symptom of a much larger problem in the industry and in IP law as a whole, though not for reasons specifically related to Nintendo. As such, we'll explore both the reasons why I think this bricking business isn't a big deal in isolation, but also why this is actually a massive deal in a broader sense. I'm Mooney, this is Moon Channel, and this video is brought to you by our sponsor, Mantis Sleep. I jumped at the opportunity to be sponsored by our friends here at Mantis Sleep, because let me tell you something, there's virtually nothing that I love more than sleep. And if you are one of the many viewers who feel sleepy when you hear my voice, then boy howdy do I have exactly the product for you. Mantis Sleep was kind enough to send both myself and Moon Channel artist and co-creator Lorita these lovely Mantis Sleep sound sleeping masks. They fit any shape of head, any size of person, and offer truly blackout visuals for a serene and blissful rest. But best of all, they come with built-in ultra-thin Bluetooth-enabled high-quality headphones that are so light that you can barely tell they're there, but that still produce lovely sound quality. Co-creator Lorita points out that the Mantis Sleep mask is highly adjustable, and that she was able to achieve 100% blackout by easily adjusting the eye cups in the mask. The eye cups as well are a lot more comfortable than a traditional sleeping mask and specifically accommodate all sleeping styles, including side sleepers. If the sound mask is a bit too fancy for you though, Mantis Sleep offers all kinds of different masks suited for different purposes. So take a look at the Mantis Sleep catalog and see which one fits your needs best. You's gonna be sleeping with the fishes. The manta ray fishes. That is, with Mantis Sleep. Just go to mantisleep.com and use the discount code MOONCHANNEL at checkout to receive up to 10% off your new Mantis Sleep mask. Or check out the affiliate links attached to this very video, I get a commission on that. And as Moon Channel donates 10% of its gross revenue to charity, sponsors like Mantis Sleep and viewers like you can make a big difference. That's mantisleep.com discount code MOONCHANNEL at checkout to receive 10% off your new Mantis Sleep mask. A special thanks to Mantis Sleep for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into any exploration of the law itself, let's review the facts of our case. On or about May 8, 2025, Stephen Totillo over at Gamefile.news produced an excellent and comprehensive report on various changes made to the Nintendo Account User Agreement and the Nintendo Privacy Policy. These are contracts that you as a Nintendo product purchaser and user must abide by if you are to use said product. Totillo notes that most of the changes made were to the Nintendo Account User Agreement, which is an end-user license agreement, or EULA, specifically pertaining to the use of one's Nintendo account. You will note right away that neither the Nintendo Account User Agreement nor the Privacy Policy Agreement specifically pertain to the Switch 2 console. Indeed, the Switch 2, like any console produced by any company, has its own EULA. We'll get to that EULA in just a little bit, but let's return for a moment to Totillo's analysis. Totillo notes that the Nintendo account EULA was updated with the following language. Without limitation, you agree that you may not A. Publish, copy, modify, reverse engineer, lease, rent, decompile, disassemble, distribute, offer for sale, or create derivative works of any portion of the Nintendo account services. B. Bypass, modify, decrypt, defeat, tamper with, or otherwise circumvent any of the functions or protections of the Nintendo account services, including through the use of any hardware or software that would cause the Nintendo account services to operate other than in accordance with its documentation and intended use. C. Obtain, install, or use any unauthorized copies of Nintendo account services, or D. Exploit the Nintendo account services in any manner other than to use them in accordance with the applicable documentation and intended use, in each case without Nintendo's written consent or express authorization, or unless otherwise expressly permitted by applicable law. You acknowledge that if you fail to comply with the foregoing restrictions, Nintendo may render the Nintendo account services and/or the applicable Nintendo device permanently unusable in whole or in part. Totillo concludes from this reading that, and I quote, "If you modify your Switch, obtain pirated copies of games, or do anything else that wasn't intended by Nintendo without their okay, they reserve the right to brick your console." Here's the thing though, right? Totillo's conclusion is too wide in scope. This updated EULA focuses on the Nintendo account. This is the Nintendo account user agreement. And in this case, the power to render the applicable Nintendo device permanently unusable in whole or in part is specifically related to Nintendo account services. Now let's be clear, Totillo isn't necessarily wrong about Nintendo's wider ability to render your console inoperable, but like a math student who has arrived at the right answer through the wrong equation, this body of text concerning Nintendo account services does not get us all the way there. This EULA exclusively pertains to misuse of one's Nintendo account. We'll get to the wider picture in just a moment. Totillo's second observation is that parents are now on the hook for their kids. The April 2021 Nintendo account user agreement merely notes that those under the age of 18 must have a parent or guardian read and accept the agreement on their behalf, whereas the present agreement notes that the parent or guardian are also responsible for the use of the under 18 individual and any issues or claims related to the Nintendo account services. Totillo notes that this might be related to class action suits over Joy-Con drift, wherein the lawyers of the suing parents attempted to make the argument that the children had clicked on said agreements and that minors couldn't be bound by such arrangements. Totillo continues by also observing that the case was eventually dismissed, and that other such cases were settled via arbitration. Totillo also coyly asks whether the loophole has finally been closed. Lastly, Totillo notes that Nintendo's privacy policy has been updated to show that it can monitor and record your video and audio interactions with other users as long as it has your consent. The original title of this section of Totillo's article was Big Mario Brother is Watching, which, while evocative, turned out to be a bit of an overreach. To Totillo's credit, the article was updated on May 9th after a Nintendo rep reached out to GameFile, clarifying that conversations are not sent to Nintendo unless a user submits them while reporting someone for problematic conduct. This is, of course, completely expected behavior and consistent with any other EULA which touches upon online communication and reporting systems. Totillo's article was deeply insightful, and he did a great job breaking down the various points of each agreement. However, good journalism on its own seldom brings the necessary attention to one's work, and Totillo's initial reporting, as we can see with section titles like Big Mario Brother is Watching You, or the overextension of purported scope concerning the Nintendo Account Services Agreement, was a bit, not a lot, just a bit, hyperbolic. But hyperbole and overreaction is the name of the game when it comes to news about Nintendo, and what started out as a slightly hyperbolic snowball of news flew down the mountain slope, accumulating in size as it went until the news transformed into Nintendo announces it can brick your console whenever it wants. This in turn has led to an endless parade of different posts and different articles on Nintendo's ability to brick your Switch 2. Here's a snippet from a post on the Nintendo Life forums by user Dalladog dated June 15, 2025, a month after Totillo's initial article. And I quote, "Let me first start off by saying that I in no way condone piracy, but do you feel as though you really own your Switch 2 if Nintendo is allowed to do this? Seemingly, they have the right to render your console permanently unusable if you dare to modify it in any way that they don't approve of. Let that sink in for a bit. The console that you paid for, brought home and set up in your living room is not actually yours, and you are just leasing it from Nintendo, and they're just letting you borrow it with conditions. Want to fix your Joy-Con drift or put in some extra apps by yourself? Nah, sorry, that might brick your system. Curious about how your favorite games work under the hood? Too bad. Nintendo might remotely disable your device. You get the picture, right? Lay people like Daladog were utterly outraged by Nintendo's apparently overly strict behavior and ability to disable something that you own, almost as if you didn't own it at all. As if you were merely leasing the hardware from Nintendo. And not helping the simmering outrage were the various commentators all over the internet parodying these talking points without necessarily actually understanding anything about the wider legal context these talking points are built upon. As I alluded to in the introduction of this video, there are parts of this narrative that are not accurate and in isolation are also not problematic. However, there is a wider legal dynamic at play that is problematic and is not isolated to Nintendo. Unlike previous law review videos then, what I think we'll do is we will break down the issue of Nintendo's power to brick consoles into what isn't a problem and what might be a problem, in a way that might be a bit more digestible to the layperson. We'll start our analysis proper then with some very simple questions. Can Nintendo actually brick your console? And if so, is that provision of the EULA, and thereby that power, unique to Nintendo? The following section might seem like a bit of a defense of Nintendo, and in a roundabout way, it kind of is. I mentioned earlier that Totillo's initial article on GameFile concerning Nintendo's ability to brick your Switch arrived at the right answer using the wrong equation. Well, here's what I mean. Totillo noted that Nintendo can brick your Switch too if you utilize your Nintendo account in ways that violate the Nintendo account's license agreement. The scope of that language, however, was limited to the Nintendo account. The switch to EULA proper, however, extends the scope of the language. Let's read the very first paragraph of Section 1 of the EULA together and then look at some other relevant sections in part. And I quote, "Subject to the terms of this agreement, Nintendo grants you a non-exclusive, revocable license to use the software solely on the console for your personal non-commercial use. For clarity, the software is licensed, not sold to you, and you may not make use of the software except as expressly authorized by this agreement. Without limitation," here we go again. "You agree that you may not A. publish, copy, modify, reverse engineer, lease, rent, decompile, disassemble, distribute, offer for sale, or create derivative works of any portion of the software, B. bypass," you know what? Let's skip this part. "Etc., etc., you acknowledge that if you fail to comply with the foregoing restrictions, Nintendo may render the console and or the software permanently unusable in whole or in part." Section 2 has a similar provision. "After the software is updated or changed, including without limitation in connection with an update, any existing or future unauthorized modification of the console or the software or the use of an unauthorized device in connection with the console may render the console and/or the software permanently unusable in whole or in part." And Section 5 also has a similar provision. "Without limiting the foregoing, you acknowledge and agree that if Nintendo in its sole discretion determines or reasonably suspects that you have violated this agreement or our community guidelines, Nintendo may implement technical measures designed to disable your access to or use of any or all of the software or the console." So in essence, yes, Nintendo can brick your console. But this is not a problem in isolation, in my opinion, for two important reasons. The first reason is, this is nothing new. The power to brick your console has always existed. And though you may have been ignorant of it, and though it may at times have been obfuscated from you, it was always in Nintendo's power to remove the functionality of your console via manipulation of its software. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you're attending Moon Channel University and you're in Professor Mooney's classroom. On the first day of class, you review the syllabus and discover, hey, there's no provision here that says I can't cheat. So, on the first exam, you plagiarize an essay and you copy the work of your neighbor, only for Assistant Professor Larita Shine to discover you cheating. You are brought to Principal Maya, who declares that you are expelled for cheating, and you say, but wait a second, the syllabus didn't say that I can't cheat. I was allowed to cheat. Well, says Principal Maya, the syllabus isn't the complete context. There exists a body of rules and law outside of the four corners of the syllabus that also gives us the permission to expel a student who cheats. You might be very unhappy about that, but it's not fair. The syllabus should say so that it's more clear to future students. And you know what? You'd have a point. Which is why I think it is a good thing that user agreements like Nintendo's make very clear the powers that Nintendo has over you and your console. The four corners of the end-user license agreement are not where the rights that Nintendo has over your console begin and end, and indeed, the power to brick your console has always been implicit even before the internet made that necessarily possible. But why can companies like Nintendo exercise so much power over something you own, and by what legal mechanisms are they able to enforce that power? When you bought the Switch 2, isn't it your property now? Don't you own that physical device? How can they deprive you of it? Well, in order to understand the how, we must understand the differences between the legal ownership of software and of hardware. Let's do it like this. I'll start this discussion within the context of my area of foremost relevant expertise, which is American intellectual property law. Once we've set that stage, we'll expand our scope to include other bodies of law and see how the context changes. In any case, when you buy a video game console, you are actually buying two separate things, one of which you own and one of which you lease. The physical console, the object in 3D space, is the thing you own. You can light the Switch 2 on fire, you can throw enough of the Empire State Building, you can ask if it prefers Pepsi over Coca-Cola, and you can take it out for dinner and never call it again. That is totally up to you. But the second thing you are buying is a license to the software that makes the Switch 2 function. The software remains the intellectual property of the publisher, and the terms of its use are governed by the license and not by your purchase. This is not Nintendo's invention. When Daladog stated their concern about merely leasing their console and not owning it, well, this is nothing new. Consider, for example, the Ninth Circuit's decision in Werner vs. Autodesk Incorporated, which dates back to 2010. In this case, Tim Werner, a reseller, bought secondhand copies of Autodesk's AutoCAD software from a company that had purchased it but no longer needed it. The EULA for AutoCAD, however, contained a specific provision that the software was licensed and not sold, and thereby that the software could not be transferred or resold. When Werner then put the discs for sale on eBay, Autodesk responded with a DMCA takedown. Werner then sued and claimed protection under the First Sale Doctrine. The First Sale Doctrine, as stated in 17 U.S.C. Section 109, is a copyright law that limits a copyright holder's control over a particular copy of a work after its first authorized sale. Which is to say, if you buy a copyrighted work, you are then free to sell, lend, or give away that work without needing the copyright owner's permission. If you buy a book, that book can then be donated to the library, and the library can lend it without asking the book publisher for permission. The question is, was Werner the lawful owner of said software copies, or was he just a licensee? The lower court, the district court, ruled in Werner's favor, stating that the First Sale Doctrine applied and that Werner could resell the software legally. However, the circuit court, the higher court, reversed the initial decision and put together a three-factor legal test to determine whether a software user is or isn't a licensee. If the software owner, the licensor, number 1, explicitly designates the transaction as a license and not a sale. Number 2, imposes significant transfer restrictions such as retention of title or non-transferability. And number 3, imposes notable usage restrictions such as a ban on modification, reverse engineering, or copying, then the software user is, more likely than not, a licensee. Because Autodesk specifically described its agreement as a license and not a sale, Autodesk retained title. What does that mean? Well, the original buyer of this software was Cardinal Technologies. They are the licensee. Werner's rights were derivative of Cardinal's rights. He is not the licensee. As Cardinal was never the owner of the software to begin with, and merely a licensee, they could not transfer the ownership or the license. Remember, it's non-transferable to Werner, who thereafter has no right to resell it. You can't get ownership rights downstream if the upstream party also doesn't have those rights, and it doesn't matter whether or not Werner ever clicked I agree. The licensing restriction was attached to the copy and not the person. And the Werner case was built on precedent and complements decisions such as My Systems Corp. Versus Peak Computer Incorporated, which in 1993 established that loading software into RAM counts as copying, making said action an infringement of a license if said copier was never the owner. And Pro CD Inc. v. Zeidenberg, which upheld the enforceability of shrink-wrap licenses even after purchase. And I shared all of this with you in order to show you that this is nothing new. You have not owned your console's software since even before the DMCA was signed into law. You may just be discovering it now, but you have likely always been a licensee. There's an ulterior motive, however, for my long tangent. We've established that in American law, you might own the console, but you do not own the software. You are but a licensee of that software. What this means in practice is that you are licensing the functionality of the console. Let's do some math together, shall we? If the software powers and runs the console, and you license the software, then your right to use the hardware depends on your continuing license to use said software. The implication then exists that if you revoke or breach that software license, you may lose the rights to the software that makes the hardware function. If, after a breach, you are no longer a valid licensee, then any use of the software, even if pre-installed, is unauthorized, and a licensor can take action to prevent that infringement. Which is to say, the licensor, the software owner, can enforce its rights over the license even if the EULA never expressly states that it can. There are implied powers that stem from the contextual body of law that surrounds the license. Consider, for example, MDY Industries LLC v. Blizzard Entertainment Incorporated. MDY Industries developed and sold a bot for World of Warcraft called Glider, and bots like Glider were expressly prohibited under Blizzard's EULA for WoW. Although Blizzard's EULA contained no language at the time concerning disabling features or bricking, the Ninth Circuit nevertheless held that Blizzard, as the manufacturer and owner, could still enforce license compliance with technical control. It's not just the Ninth Circuit either. In the Second Circuit, we have cases like Universal City Studios v. Corley, which established as early as 2001 that license terms can override actions that the Copyright Act would otherwise allow, and that licensors can enforce access control measures even without explicit language while simultaneously disregarding fair use defenses in that context. The point is, you don't need bricking language to brick. As long as you are a licensee, which you virtually always are, if you violate the terms of the license, there is an implied right for the licensor to pull access to said software, which inadvertently bricks your device. If you can brick without explicit language though, then why is Nintendo adding this language to their EULA at all? Well, there are two reasons. One selfish reason and one unselfish reason. The selfish reason is Nintendo doesn't want to have to relitigate this in court. It has the implied power, and there is plenty of case law, but it's easier to point to a specific provision in your EULA rather than to litigate it and point at an implied right. There is an unselfish reason though, and genuinely so. I mentioned in my Minecraft EULA video that if companies really wanted to play gotcha and hit you when you aren't expecting it, it is in their best interest to obfuscate the powers that they have. And this behavior is not actually that uncommon. The companies that are not disclosing this power they have over you aren't doing it because they're generous or won't execute said power if they need to. Listen to me well, dear friends. Disclosure is good. It is good for me, it is good for you, it is good for the company. Let's go back to the Switch 2 licensing agreement, Section 1. The first sentence is, we grant you a license. What are the very next words in that section? For clarity. For clarity. In law, in contracts, and license agreements, clarity is good. It is good guy behavior. Okay? Don't get it twisted. If Nintendo always had the power to enforce and could hide like a trapdoor spider to snag people pirating stuff, then disclosure gives greater power to the pirate, to the modifier, etc., to avoid that trap, right? The clarity is for our benefit, and arguably to Nintendo's detriment in that case. There's a balancing test, right? There is a selfish reason, absolutely. But for the rest of us, for presumably even people like Daladog, this clarity is good. But the story doesn't end there. I stated earlier that I think Nintendo being able to brick your console isn't a problem in isolation for two reasons. We've covered that first reason, that Nintendo could always brick your console in some detail. The second reason that I don't think this bricking language is a problem in isolation is that the power to brick your console is neither exclusive to Nintendo nor anything new. Let me show you, because all of this panic around bricking devices is honestly a little silly given how prevalent this kind of language really is. Let's start with Microsoft. In the EULA for the Xbox family of consoles, which includes the Series X, the 360, and the Xbox One, in Section 2, subsection B, it states in no unclear terms, as conditions to this Xbox software license, you agree that, number 1, you will not use unauthorized accessories or unauthorized games. They may not work or may stop working permanently after an Xbox software update. You will not use or install any unauthorized software. If you do, your Xbox console, Kinect sensor, or authorized accessory may stop working permanently at that time or after a later Xbox software update. You will not attempt to defeat or circumvent any Xbox console, Connect sensor, or authorized accessory technical limitation, security, or anti-piracy system. If you do, your Xbox console, Connect sensor, or authorized accessory may stop working permanently at that time or after a later Xbox software update. Number 4, Microsoft may use technical measures including Xbox software updates to prevent use of unauthorized accessories and unauthorized games, and to protect the technical limitations, security, and anti-piracy systems in the Xbox console, Connect sensor, or authorized accessory. Number 5, Microsoft may update the Xbox software from time to time without further notice to you, for example, to update any technical limitation, security, or anti-piracy system. Microsoft's been doing it all along, right, for the longest time, and nobody cared. Why? Well, here is the PlayStation 4, not the 5, the 4 end-user license agreement. To be fair to Sony, I'm even going to use the Wayback Machine and pull the earliest version available. Back in September of 2020, Section 7 reads, and I quote, "If SIE, hereinafter Sony, determines that you have violated this agreement's terms, Sony may itself or may procure the taking of any action to protect its interests, such as disabling access to or use of some or all system software, disabling use of this PS4 system online or offline, termination of your access to PlayStation Network, denial of any warranty, repair, or other services provided for your PS4 system, implementation of automatic or mandatory updates or devices intended to discontinue unauthorized use, or reliance on any other remedial efforts as reasonably necessary to prevent the use of modified or unpermitted use of system software." Sony has had the power to break your consoles since 2020, and nobody cared either. Why? In fact, let's go one step further with our old pal Sony. This is the most recent PlayStation 3 EULA, dated December 10th, 2009. In Section 7, the EULA states, and I quote, "If SCE, hereinafter Sony, determines that you have violated the terms of this agreement, Sony may take all actions to protect its interests, including denial of any services such as warranty services and repair services provided for your PS3 system, and termination of your access to PlayStation Network, implementation of upgrades or devices intended to discontinue unauthorized use, or reliance on any other remedial efforts as reasonably necessary to prevent the use of a modified PS3 system, or any pirated material or equipment. Sony and its licensors reserve the right to bring legal action in the event of a violation of this agreement. Sony reserves the right to participate in any government or private legal action or investigation related to your content." The language is a little different, a little more coy, but the authority is there. Implementation of upgrades or devices intended to discontinue unauthorized use, or reliance on any other remedial efforts as reasonably necessary. Sony has outright stated that they can brick your console since the PS3, and I'd wager good money that the PS2 EULA said something similar, though it's not available through the PlayStation website. But just to say, Sony's actually been doing this since 2009, and nobody cared. Why? What makes Nintendo so special? Why does everyone suddenly care now that Nintendo has added language to its end-user license agreement that has been boilerplate in every other console's license agreements since before Ariana Grande was old enough to vote? Sabrina Carpenter was 10 years old when Sony declared that it could and would brick your consoles. Where has this outrage been for the past sixth of a century? Heck, Sony was even arguably the first console manufacturer to pull the trigger on a technical enforcement action with brick-like effects. Consider Sony Computer Entertainment Incorporated v. HOTS, where Sony sued George Hotz and the jailbreaking organization Fail Overflow. When the PS3 launched, it permitted users to install Linux via a feature called Other OS. But George Hotz found a way to use this feature to jailbreak the PS3, which allowed Hotz and his organization, Fail Overflow, to bypass Sony's firmware protections and run unauthorized code on the PS3. Sony then released a firmware update that removed the Other OS feature, which rendered the consoles of many users who had specifically purchased their PS3s for Linux support and integration unusable in the ways that they would have preferred. I won't get too deep into the weeds here, but Sony continued to issue other firmware updates specifically targeted at blocking the use of unauthorized code. Although Sony never totally bricked a console per se, they leveraged the same reserved rights under their EULA so that they could restrict functionality. These same rights could allow for the full bricking of a system. Sony's decision to sue HOTS got them hacked by Anonymous and everything. It was big news back in the day, yet somehow everyone forgot. So again, why now? It's Nintendo, isn't it? That's the difference. It's because Nintendo is extra litigious, and it's important to raise a stink about it. It's Nintendo that's doing something that it's never done before after all with this bricking language, and it's up to us gamers to stop them. Except of course, this language also isn't new to Nintendo. Here's the end-user license agreement for the Nintendo Wii, last updated on June 22nd, 2010. Chapter 2, Unauthorized Software, Services, or Devices, or Unlicensed Accessories. Your Wii console and the Wii Network service are not designed for use with unauthorized software, services, or devices, or non-licensed accessories, and you may not use any of these with your Wii console or the Wii Network service. Such use may be illegal, voids any warranty, and is a breach of this agreement. Such use may also lead to injury to you or others, or cause performance issues or damage to your Wii console or the Wii Network service. We and our licensees and distributors are not responsible for damage or loss caused by unauthorized software, services, or devices or non-licensed accessories. We may take steps to disable or delete any unauthorized software, services, or devices installed in your Wii console, for example, by detecting and disabling them through the Wii Network service and/or game software. If we detect unauthorized software, services, or devices, your access to the Wii Network service may be disabled and/or the Wii console or games may be unplayable. There it is, plain as day. Bricking language from the distant and far off here of 2010. Nintendo has always had this power, and they've even written about it for you. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of it. Let me offer you a disclaimer. I don't hold Stephen Totilo responsible for any of this. Gamefile.news is some of the best games reporting in the industry, and Totilo does a bang-up job. I'm a paid subscriber of Gamefile. But I think the typical journalistic flair in Totilo's original article, a flair that can sometimes come across as slightly hyperbolic, was improperly processed and then run by less reputable reporters and media outlets with only increasing hyperbole, until the refrain from gamers became hysterical. That said, I don't think all the outrage is necessarily unfair, it is just misdirected. Now that we understand the legal reasons why I think this Nintendo bricking business isn't a very big deal, let's talk about what I do think is a big problem. That being the intellectual property law landscape that both permits and necessitates this sort of behavior. And we're going to start our understanding of that wider problem not in the United States, but in Uruguay.
よし、これから世界会議を始めるぞ。世界中の問題をみんなで一つ一つ解決していこうじゃないか。難しい問題も俺たちが力を合わせればきっといい方向に行く。君たちの率直な意見をぜひここで聞かせてくれ。じゃあまず俺から行くぞ。今話題の地球温暖化だけど、でっかいヒーローをみんなで作って地球をガードしてもらえば OK だと思うんだよ。ちなみに反対意見は認めないぞ。
In 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was signed between the various trading nations of the world minus the communist bloc, with the primary focus of reducing tariffs and quotas for goods, and building the foundations of a system of global free trade. For its time, GATT was quite revolutionary, but by the 80s, global trade had radically changed. Instead of just moving physical goods around, you had to figure out how trade works relative to services, or ownership rights of agricultural goods, or new pharmaceuticals, and of course, intellectual property. GATT, you see, didn't cover patents, or software, or enforcement mechanisms, or any of that stuff. And the developed countries of the world wanted stronger protections for their new export sectors. Thus, in September of 1986, 123 different countries came together in Punta del Este, Uruguay, to negotiate a new agreement for trade that expanded beyond goods to include services, investment, and intellectual property rights. Now, at the time, IP enforcement was largely handled by the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which was a UN-affiliated body. But like most UN-affiliated bodies, it sometimes lacked teeth. The United States in particular saw the WIPO as too weak and preferred a system that could more effectively enforce commercial rights in line with US interests. What the US wanted was intellectual property rights backed by the GATT system, which is to say enforcement of IP rights backed by trade sanctions. The US wanted the power to leverage its market dominance, its economic hegemony, to protect the intellectual property rights of its corporations. And you'd better believe that American corporations lobbied very hard for such enforcement mechanisms. Don't take my word for it, the Intellectual Property Committee was a coalition of 13 US corporations, which included General Electric, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, Monsanto, and Pfizer, amongst others, and it was specifically organized to lobby for an international IP agreement designed around American law. In any case, the United States knew that it had a dominant position in global IP ownership, and it sought to protect its advantages at any cost, even, and perhaps especially if, it meant damaging the ability of developing countries to independently innovate. To that end, the American proposal was quite simple. Everyone should adopt our American framework for IP law, a framework which is specifically designed to entrench corporate control over intellectual property at the expense of the public benefit. Naturally, the developing world found this idea quite abhorrent. They argued that intellectual property as a concept will raise the cost of essential goods such as medicines, stifle innovation in developing countries, and limit local production. You'll keep us poor and sell us your stuff while preventing us from innovating as you have. But the developing countries didn't have the power to overwhelm the US in negotiations. For you see, Canada and Australia joined with the United States as they had similar interests, as did Japan, which was entering into its own economic golden age in the late 80s. But what about the Europeans? Well, the European Economic Community, the EEC, which at the time consisted of Belgium, Denmark, France, West Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the UK, were initially opposed to the proposed IP changes. European IP legal frameworks tended to be far more protective of consumer rights and more balanced in scope than the US's increasingly corporations-first approach. European patent systems at the time had specific exemptions, for example, for research use or for public health. The Europeans were genuinely quite concerned about their sovereignty here, over their ability to determine their own IP laws and rights. And yet Europe still conceded and gave in to American negotiators after receiving agricultural concessions. The EEC, which later became the European Union in 1993 as per the Maastricht Treaty, you see, was more concerned at the time with its agricultural interests. They wanted to protect their farmers and avoid having to cut agricultural subsidies or lift trade protections. The Americans were happy to shake hands on that deal. They weren't the ones who would be hurt by that anyhow. Only the developing world would be hurt by European agricultural trade protections, and who cares about them anyway, right? The European agricultural protections remain a major grievance, by the way, in the World Trade Organization to this very day, with the African continent in particular having its trade negatively and arguably unfairly impacted. The latest WTO negotiations, the Doha Round, which started in 2001, involve these European trade balances in large part. But I digress. In any case, the Uruguay round negotiations lasted from 1986 until 1994 and concluded in the Marrakesh Agreement, which established the World Trade Organization, but also finalized the TRIPS Agreement, which bound all members to enforce IP protections including copyright, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets with American law as its influence. Sure, the Europeans got a say in TRIPS, and the agreement incorporated older WIPO practices, but this was an initiative built by the United States, spearheaded by the United States, and ultimately pushed through because of the United States. The United States, at the behest of its corporate lobbyists, had established a pro-American, corporatist framework of intellectual property that it could enforce via trade sanctions. And that compliance, by the way, includes the United States. The much despised DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, passed in 1998, was the U.S. domestic implementation of the WIPO Copyright Treaty of 1996, which was a treaty that expanded and built upon the initial TRIPS agreement. And the United States, as promised, has used its trade leverage to force the provisions of the DMCA, including DRM protection clauses and anti-circumvention laws, upon the rest of the world. Japan was pressured by the United States under threat of trade restrictions to amend its Copyright Act multiple times. The European Union was pressured into similar measures vis-à-vis the EU Copyright Directive. Brazil specifically has tried to escape the grasp of the United States by issuing compulsory licenses for AIDS drugs, which attracted the ire of American pharmaceutical companies and which has caused Brazil to be placed on the USTR Special 301 Report Priority Watch List multiple times. Don't protect your people from AIDS, or the US will economically destroy you. South Korea was forced to sign the core U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 2007, which forced the Koreans to adopt DMCA-style anti-circumvention rules and extended copyright terms, amongst other things. These were very one-sided changes, and they massively undermined Korean digital rights. In response, there were mass protests in Korea over this kowtowing to American interests. But what was South Korea supposed to do against the economic might of the United States? It's either obey or be sanctioned, and South Korea could hardly afford the latter. I could go on, in country after country after country. The point is, you may look at your country's protections and think, I'm safe. My country cares more about IP rights than the US does. My country has better consumer protections. But I'm here to tell you that most of international IP law is quite standardized, and there is only so much deviation from the norm that exists, or can exist, before the lidless American eye turns towards you to annuit your coeptus. The EU, for example, has more comprehensive consumer protection laws than the United States. The CRD, the Consumer Rights Directive, protects the European consumer from unfair contract terms. The Digital Content Directive forbids updates that degrade or remove core features unless contractually agreed upon. But of course, you have agreed to a contract, haven't you? Maybe we'll discuss that directive some other day in its own video. There's the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which gives the EU consumer far greater control over their personal data than we have here in the United States. And yet they still get your data somehow, don't they? But EU states must comply with the TRIPS agreement, and the TRIPS agreement requires effective enforcement of IP rights, and even if bricking isn't explicitly mentioned in European EULAs, for intentional breaches such as piracy, the bricking of consoles or partial bricking may be deemed a so-called proportionate enforcement. But Mooney, I can hear you say, our EULAs in Europe do not have this bricking language. Ja, bist du dir da sicher? Are you sure about that? Here's the EULA for the PS5 in German, Section 6. Der Beendigung der Online- und Offline-Nutzung dieses PS5-Systems durch sie. Terminating your online and offline use of this PS5 system. It's the same language. The EU has more ostensible protections, and it has peripheral mechanisms that at least try to lessen the harshness of TRIPS. And yet while you can run, you cannot hide. Your software is still licensed, and the strict IP enforcement measurements baked into TRIPS make it difficult, if not impossible, for compliant states to outright forbid restricting device functionality in response to license violations without running afoul of their trade commitments or provoking trade retaliation from the United States. Wir bilden einen Lebenreigen. Ich werde euch die Richtung zeigen. I know the very useful steps, and I will protect you from the missteps. In a manner of speaking, we are all living in America. What about a less cooperative state, though? Like Brazil. Brazil has very strong consumer protection laws, and courts tend to favor consumers. Just recently, the Sao Paulo branch of Brazil's Consumer Protection and Defense Program, Procon-SP, requested changes to clauses considered abusive in contracts with Brazilian consumers, presumably in this case, the controversial bricking clauses. Nintendo doesn't even have offices in Brazil, and thus Procon had to reach out directly to Nintendo HQ in the United States. In response, Nintendo simply hired a law firm in Brazil to handle the dispute. In the words of Procon-SP's own publication, the formal lack of representation in this country is an important warning to consumers. Without this legal presence, the protection provided for in the Consumer Protection Code is limited. There's little Procon-SP can do to force the hand of Nintendo here in the United States. And while Procon-SP can file a complaint and try to coerce Nintendo to remove its clause for good publicity, remember that Nintendo never needed the clause to begin with. Brazil is a TRIPS signatory, and its IP laws were updated as per Brazilian Law No. 9609 on February 19, 1998 to include strong IP enforcement provisions. Courts can still permit seizure or deactivation of equipment. And while Procon-SP can raise a fuss about it, they are but a regional branch of the wider Brazilian Consumer Protection and Defense Program. Greater consumer rights might exist in Brazil, and Brazil might not be entirely beholden to American interests, but Brazil does not have complete sovereignty over its IP laws, and none of Brazil's protections are absolute if they come into conflict with the interests of the United States. All of it is lipstick on a pig. TRIPS signatories can offer stronger rights than the United States, but they cannot take the pig out of the room. The foundational structure of global IP enforcement is still American, is still rooted in TRIPS, GATT, and the TRIPS Plus policies that have flowed out of the DMCA, out of American jurisprudence, out of the mouths of America's corporate lobbyists, and into your legal systems by threat of economic force. That, to me, is the bigger problem. Until the world can revisit TRIPS and create a better, less American and less corporately dictated top-down framework for intellectual property, unless states with the power to resist American pressure like the European Union or Brazil choose to take a principled stand even at the risk of potential US sanction, or unless we Americans elect to fight against our own corporate interest for the betterment of the global public, you and I, the consumer, will be ever at the mercy of corporations, and the global IP system will continue to prioritize corporate control over public interest.
米国東インド艦隊司令長官 上位カートライト提督。私は通訳の WD です。我ら米国はこの国との通商を求めてやってきました。
そんな大それたこと言われても。それに異国の船は即刻打ち払いというお触れが出とりますゆえ。
間違えちゃいけない。我々はお願いに来てるのではない。これは命令なのですよ。それとも我らと戦争でもしたいですか？
Nintendo could always brick your console. But for most of us, it won't. Don't mistake it won't, however, for it can't. Unless you live in like Eritrea or North Korea, your country has almost certainly been forced to accept the global international status quo for intellectual property law, including the harsh rules of enforcement that are permitted with regards to license violation. Nearly every country in the world has adopted the TRIPS agreement, often under trade pressure from the United States. Even in Brazil or the European Union, where consumer rights are stronger and legal systems more protective, there are limits to how far those protections can stretch when they conflict with American interest. Your country might delay or soften the blow, but it doesn't have the sovereignty to completely rewrite the rules. It's not a big deal to me that Nintendo has this new bricking provision in its latest EULA. It's been the industry standard for decades. It's not a big deal to me that Nintendo has reserved the right to ban Nintendo accounts that use names it doesn't like. It's their service and you use it on their terms. If the enforceability of their terms feels wrong to you, if you think other rules should also apply, well, you and I are in agreement there. But that's not a grievance that begins or ends with Nintendo. In fact, I think it's a good thing that Nintendo is being more transparent and clearer about the powers that they actually have. At its core, your grievance and mine are more structural. Don't miss the forest for the trees. It is to the industry's benefit if you get stuck staring at Nintendo but don't see Microsoft or Sony or Valve. And heck, it's to the detriment of us all if we get stuck staring at the industry and thereby ignore the loaded economic gun that America has pointed at the head of the world. I've been your host, Mooney, and this video... I was going to cut this segment, but apparently it's become big news of late, so I've re-added it without a clean transition. Maybe I'll turn this snippet into a short too. This video tells you a lot about what the problem fundamentally is with IP law all around the world and how that pertains to video games, but it doesn't give you any clear solutions on how to fight for your rights. Well, let's talk about that. It's very hard to fight for your IP rights, and that's because the quote-unquote enemy is purposefully obfuscated from you. How in the world is the layperson supposed to know anything about these international trade agreements, never mind unravel them enough to put together any kind of notable movement to facilitate a directed change? Consider, for example, the Stop Killing Games movement started by Ross Scott. Stop Killing Games is, and I quote, a consumer movement started to challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games they have sold to consumers. This is an extremely ambitious and I think deeply laudable effort, but there is good news and bad news here. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is, legally speaking, the Stop Killing Games movement, in light of what we've just discussed, is not that likely to prevail on the merits. TRIPS compliance specifically protects rights holder controls and upholds anti-circumvention rules, which in turn means publishers have a de facto right to kill games as per Articles 11 through 12 and Article 41. But let's say this movement gets strong enough that domestic laws are passed that can circumvent or supersede the TRIPS agreement. Well, then you have to contend with trade pressure from the United States, and the EU or Brazil or Korea or Japan will not risk trade sanctions from the United States to protect the critically endangered remaining player base of Ubisoft's The Crew. As for change in the United States itself, you can bet your bottom dollar that Stop Killing Games will not make any headway here. At least, not anytime soon. This is why, as per Stop Killing Games' own website, past actions have been met with sandbag after sandbag. Every single result has ended in some kind of non-response, obfuscation, or quagmire. Even in consumer-friendly Brazil, SKG ran into an arbitrary bureaucratic wall and faltered. This is because, quite simply, there are larger forces at play, and in the legal and geopolitical realm, the efforts of Stop Killing Games are like attempting to punch through a mountain made of obsidian guarded by an ender dragon. But here's the good news. Even if SKG doesn't achieve its de facto goals, your personal interest in it, your involvement, and your pressure demonstrates that public frustration at the status quo exists. And no matter how much your government might be afraid of the United States, I promise you, it fears you more. SKG might be met with sandbag after sandbag, but the number of people punching obsidian blocks is growing, and with numbers, with voices, with volume, results that will not be given can instead be seized. If we leave things as they are and presume that things are legal impossibilities, we are guaranteed to fail. Change will not come from above. Even if SKG doesn't achieve its primary goals, if it can even achieve peripheral goals, it can bring visibility to the greater problem of international IP law. If Stop Killing Games can be a spear point that directs the public's frustration with the global IP system into the heart of bureaucracy, then I consider that a massive victory. We don't need Stop Killing Games to actually manage to stop the killing of games. We just need to make sure that we're heard, and that we continue to fight for our rights as we rage against the Mammon machine. I've been your host, Mooney. A special thanks to co-creator Lorita for the art and to Silva Gunner for the music. Moon Channel donates 10% of its entire gross revenue to charity, so I appreciate your patience with this video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. Thank you also to Moon Channel's dearly beloved patrons, without whom none of this would be possible. And last but not least, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.